All right, so we're here with Jennifer Rizzo today. She's an immigration attorney from Journey Zen Refugee Services. Jennifer, could you please explain what your title is and what Journey Zen does and what you do within Journey Zen?
Sure. I'm the Immigration Legal Services Director at Journey Zen, which means that I run the legal program. I'll tell you a bit more about the agency first and then about what the legal program does. Journey Zen is a refugee resettlement agency. We've been in existence for over 25 years. We are a mainly social service agency that does some legal work. So I say that because we provide a variety of services to our clients that we believe is a holistic service that will give them the skills and resources they need to become contributing members to society. We offer employment services, housing services, interpretation services, case management services, and legal services. Oh, and education services too. We serve refugees, we serve asylees, and we serve parolees, primarily in our social service program. The legal program will serve anybody that is a low-income immigrant or refugee. So that being said, with the social services, the legal program is open to anyone who qualifies as being low income. We offer a variety of legal services. In some cases, we're the only agency in town that do those legal services. Let's see here. My program was created in 2010 when the agency realized that there was a drastic need for this kind of service. There are a lot of refugees coming into Buffalo for resettlement, about 1,500 to 2,000 a year. And all of those refugees have legal needs. You know, they need to apply for green cards. They want to bring their family members here that they've been separated from, and there was really no lawyer in town to help them do that at a pro bono or a small fee. So that's why my program was created. We offer legal services that range from green cards, citizenship, family reunification, immigrant sponsorship, employment authorization, asylum. We do assist members of vulnerable populations like trafficking victims and domestic violence victims on a small basis. There are other agencies in town that also do that, so we don't want to step into their work. But we pretty much provide a vast variety of what I would call affirmative immigration services, and I will take on once in a while a defensive case if I think it's got a chance of winning.
Just out of curiosity, what countries or what nationalities are most of your clients coming from, or is it all over?
I'd say about 70 to 80% of my clients are refugees who've been resettled, and the other 20% are other immigrants, so some other category. The resettlement populations coming into Buffalo are coming from 10 countries. Those countries are Somalia, Congo, Burundi, Nepal, well, Bhutan, they're Nepali people coming from Bhutan, Burma, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Cuba, Eritrea. Yeah, that's 10. It's interesting to note that the United States brings in 10 populations or so for resettlement. Buffalo actually receives all of those populations. There are other places around our country that may only be getting 2 or 3 populations, but we actually get all 10 populations in, which is why we have such a diverse community here. The highest populations, the highest numbers of resettlement right now are in the Burmese, Nepali, and Iraqi communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And another thing that we'd spoken of earlier, there is a distinction between asylum and resettlement.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke with Peter Moret from Vive Incorporated, and he deals primarily with asylum cases, but you deal primarily with resettlement cases. I was wondering if you could talk about the differences between those two.
Sure. You said asylum and resettlement. I would actually say that the distinction is between a refugee and asylee, because those are the legal definitions. To understand this, I'd like to first talk about the overall picture, which is the international definition of being a refugee. The international definition is set by the United Nations. It, generally speaking, is someone who is outside his or her country of origin, and who has been forced to flee because they have been persecuted on one of the protected grounds, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. And either they've been persecuted or fear future persecution, and they're outside that country of nationality. That's the international definition of being a refugee. Technically, around the world, there are about 16 million refugees identified that meet that definition. That's a very large population. The U.S. has its own definition of a refugee. That definition is spelled out in Section 207 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So anyone who meets essentially the same language, someone who's outside of his or her country of origin, who's been persecuted at one of the 5 grounds, that's a refugee. The difference is how that person enters this country when you're looking at a refugee versus an asylee or asylum seeker. A refugee, someone who's coming into the United Nations, or a refugee, someone who's coming into the United States and meets the U.S. definition, is someone who has fled their country, signed up with the United Nations, and their claim has been adjudicated by our government, by the U.S., overseas. So they've been decided over there and approved over there for refugee status, and when they enter, they are given Section 207. Literally, it's a stamp on their entrance card.
They're recognized by the United Nations overseas.
They're already recognized by the United Nations. They have to get in that line to then wait to see if they're going to be resettled. And they have to, once they're found, they're informed that they will be resettled somewhere. They have no choice over where they'll be resettled. It could be the U.S. or any of the other 15 nations that do resettlement. Once they find out that they're being considered for resettlement, then they have to go for an interview with that country and clear that country's definition of being a refugee. So the U.S. government will then award the refugee status as well. Refugee status. So when they come in, they're coming in through a resettlement process where they're given refugee status as an immigration status at entry, and then they are provided resettlement services. They're given an agency like Journey's End to help them with casework, help them find a house, get them into ESL class, find them a job, all that type of stuff. Do you want me to stop while?
Oh, that's okay. I can edit it out.
Okay. So what's important to know is that a refugee who's overseas, they give up all control over their outcome. They go sign up with the United Nations and they wait. They don't get to say, I want to go to the U.S. and no, I'm not going to go to Denmark. They don't get to say that. They have to wait until their number comes up, essentially, and then they're told resettlement for you will happen in the United States. And then they don't even get to pick Buffalo. They're just told, you're coming to Texas. I bring this up because a lot of times family units get split up. You may have like mom, dad, and 3 kids, and they've been in the camp so long, like 10, 15 years, that one of the daughters now gets married to another refugee. So then she splits off and has her own family unit. And mom, dad, and 2 kids may go to the United States, and daughter and her new husband may end up going to Denmark. And they may not see each other for years because that's all determined for them.
Right.
The main distinction with refugees that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at what's a refugee, what's an asylee. Refugees wait in line. They waited. And so when they come over here, everything is made a lot easier for them because we knew they were coming. We expected they would be coming in. So when you compare a refugee to an asylee or an asylum seeker, those are people that have entered our country that we did not anticipate coming in. We didn't know they were coming. We didn't know that they were fleeing. They meet the international definition of being a refugee, but they show up here in some other way, like visitor visa, student visa. Maybe they crawled across the border illegally, or they came in on fake documents. Those are people that are then trying to fight their case here. They want to become a refugee that gets status here. So they're actually seeking asylum, so I would call them an asylum seeker. And if they win their case, either before an immigration judge or before an administrative officer, then they will be granted asylum, which makes them an asylee under Section 208 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So there's 207 groups and there's 208 groups.
Okay.
If you don't fall into one of the 10 resettlement populations, you're never going to get 207 status for the most part. You know, if you're, I named the 10 populations for you. If you're from Nigeria or Cameroon, it's very possible you're not going to become a resettlement population because it's not defined that way right now. So you may have been persecuted and you may meet the definition of international refugee, but you'll have to come here and fight for 208 status.
Okay.
Is that clear?
Right. So how those 10 populations are set by the United States as resettlement? Those are the 10 for the United States? Or
those are the 10 that the United States accept.
Right.
There could be other populations that we're not accepting.
Right. Okay. And we'll talk about this more later, but are there reasons that you suspect for these are these the highest producers per capita of
These are populations that we've identified as being forced outside of their country of origin due to extenuating and horrible factors. And so we recognize that there's a critical need. We are an international participant. We're heavily involved in the United Nations, and it is part of our pledge, I think, in our international obligations to take in populations. And so we recognize that these 10 populations in particular have been severely persecuted. And so we've established a route to bring them here through the resettlement process. That's what I would say. The United States is actually the most generous in terms of refugee resettlement services. We accept by far the most refugees from any of the other nations that do resettlements. There's about 15 nations, I think, that do resettlement. We accept roughly 70 to 80,000 every year. That number is set by presidential executive decree. It's not a quota or a number passed by Congress. It's set by the president. And that's vastly larger than other nations. Canada, Britain, they're looking at maybe 10,000 refugees a year. You can actually go online and look and see what the numbers are in. Japan recently started taking in refugees. They took in 80 for the whole year.
Right.
So we're the most generous with who we resettle. We're also the most open with conditions and populations. For instance, we will take elderly refugees. There are other countries that won't take elderly refugees. They want marrieds, they want young people. They don't want to take on some refugee that's going to have a lot of, a drain on their social system. We take in older refugees. We will take in high-risk medical cases. We will take single children, children whose parents may have died in the camp, so we'll take orphans in. We are the most generous with what we take in and how many we take in.
Okay. One thing that I wanted to talk about, obviously, I guess one thing that you brought up before was how the UN, obviously, for your resettlement cases, plays a major role in where these refugees are assigned, what countries. Are there tensions between international law and the laws of the sovereignty? Are those usually like acting in harmony, or is there usually more conflict in terms of policy?
The international definition of a refugee is much broader in that there's 16 million people they've recognized as being outside their homeland and have been persecuted. We're not taking in, obviously, anywhere near that number. So I would say the international definition is broader. There are other populations that have been identified as refugees, for instance, the Palestinian refugee population, that the U.S. is not accepting in for resettlement. So I think you could say there's a tension between the national definition and the international definition, and that the national definition ends up being more narrow with how many people are allowed in, as compared to the international definition of how many people are recognized as having this plight.
Another thing that has been, in terms of our own policy, immigration reform has obviously been something that's been throughout the headlines in the past few months, at least. I'd like to talk about the distinction among immigrants within those groups, as well as if any of those laws or proposed reforms are applicable to the cases that you deal with.
So you want to talk about?
I'd like to talk about what groups within what various immigrant groups are being discussed right now at the federal level in terms of policy reform, and if any of the proposed legislation
will affect the populations we're talking about.
Right.
Okay. Well, immigration reform looks like it might happen this year in 2013. In January, they're being called the Gang of Eight. Senators came out with a proposal. The White House apparently had its own proposal under wraps, and they held on it because they heard that the Gang of Eight were going to release their own. So it's 8 senators, 4 Democrat, 4 Republican, who came together and had a proposal about how to reform our entire immigration system, which I think many immigration lawyers would say to you is broken. Their proposals involve looking at the large illegal population that we have in our country, which is estimated at being about 11 million immigrants. The number could actually be a lot higher. It's hard to estimate people that are illegal because they're not self-identifying. So they've been looking at potentially giving an amnesty to these people to allow them to stay. I was frankly surprised at least what was proposed, because it was a lot more generous than I thought would be suggested. They're looking at giving a grant of status and making all 11 million of those people legal for those who meet a certain set of criteria. For instance, they're looking at giving status to people who have a clean background. They're not going to allow an immigrant that's been here for a long time to stay that's got multiple crimes on their record. So they're looking at this 11 million group, setting some eligibility criteria, and then deciding, okay, of the however many remain, let's say 9 million that remain, do we want to prioritize any of those people? And they are looking right now, or at least the suggestions have been, to take the younger immigrants in that group. They're often referred to as the dreamer kids. Kids who had they didn't make a choice of their own. They were brought here when they were little by their parents as illegal immigrants, and they've been living an entire life in a legal status, and that wasn't their choice. They're going to school, they're doing well, and yet their future is being held up on them because they have no documents, they have no ID, they have no social security number. So the Obama administration has already set up a special plan for them called deferred action to allow them to get essentially identity documents for a limited time, a 2-year period. And now that this new proposal is out, they're looking at maybe giving a special, to the front of the class grant to the DACA kids, the deferred action for childhood arrival kids. So that's one group that's being separated or singled out for potentially a faster process. There also have been discussions about sectioning off the agricultural workers and giving them a faster route to status or giving them the ability to stay here longer. The 8 senators talked about how important the agricultural work is to our country's vitality and how it's really hard to find Americans who want to do that work. And so they were looking at carving out special relief provisions for those people who can demonstrate that they've worked steadily in the migrant fields. The other thing that was being discussed in the proposal was possibly tinkering with the student visa system. Right now, student visas are very specific depending on what visa you're on. I'm by no means an expert on student visas, that's business immigration, but I do know that you have to comply with the terms of your visa, and some of those visas require, after you come here and pay for education, you have to go back to your home country and perform the service there. So if you come here to become a doctor, then you have to go back to your home country and work as a doctor for at least 2 years. And there have been discussions about potentially reforming that and allowing some of those people to stay because they were trained here, they would ultimately benefit our country, and they may want to stay in our country. So those are all the things that are being discussed right now. We'll have to see if any of those will actually be passed. Another thing I think is important to note with that proposal is they were talking about the general illegal population, those that, no DACA, no agriculture, just the regular, been here for a while, illegal, entered illegally, those people. They're talking about making them wait a long time. They don't want to put them at the top and bypass all the people who have been intending a legal process to come here. There's a family immigration system in place right now and an employment immigration system in place right now where people have to wait to be sponsored to come here. And they're looking at whatever proposal they do is sending that illegal population to the back of the line where they'd have to wait 8 years or 10 years or whatever for a green card, but they would at least in the interim period be given work permission. They would identify as having status. They're looking at trying to make it fair so that way people who have been waiting in a legal sense aren't put out by this. So that's what's being discussed right now. We'll see what happens in terms of, if it's politically going to pass. Does it affect refugees or asylum seekers? No, it doesn't affect refugees. Refugees are outside of this entire population because they come in with a legal status. The number that come in per year are set by the president, not by Congress. The benefits and social services that are set up for refugees, that maybe could be tinkered with how much money is allocated, but that's really not on the table right now. What's on the table is what to deal with the illegal population. So I don't think refugees are going to be affected. Asylum seekers could be affected because asylum seekers, as I just discussed, come in a variety of ways. They may have come on a visa or they might have been here illegally. They may have a valid asylum claim. Whether or not they decided to fight their case when they got here is a question. Some people don't realize when they get here that the journey doesn't end here. You have to make your case. You have to file a claim within 1 year of entry. If you don't do that, it's a lot harder to win that asylum claim and get the Section 208 status. So there are people who may have had valid asylum claims that let that pass, didn't know about it, or couldn't find a lawyer. and now they're an illegal immigrant. So those people may be affected positively if the laws are changed.
Mm-hmm. Just want to make sure we're okay on that. Okay. Another thing that you were talking about before, I kind of wanted to talk about maybe some of the hazy spots that you've experienced with the current with some of the current policies. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was perhaps how you said the president sets the quotas. I know that there's regional allocations for where certain refugees come from. Mm-hmm. So if you'd like to discuss, if you have any opinions on how that's set, or if there's any other politically murky aspects of federal policy that you deal with.
Sure. The number of how many refugees come in every year is set by presidential executive decree. It's usually 80,000. I'll have to check for you and see if it's 80,000 this year or if it's 76. After that, then there's a determination of how many are going to come in from each population we've identified. That is part of the Department of State's prerogative. The Department of State also works with immigration and also works with ORR, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which falls under HHS, which is Health and Human Services. So you should definitely go to the Department of State's website and read up about refugee populations. Every population is different in size, and the nature of their claim is different. Some are ethnic, some are religious, the reason why they're outside their country. There are certain numbers for every population. That's set by our government. Who specifically makes those decisions, I don't know, but political pressure certainly is involved. For instance, after the Iraq War, there was a large population of Iraqi refugees who had gone into neighboring countries. These are refugees who may have assisted the U.S. military, by either working as interpreters or serving on the base or, selling, commissary stuff to them or whatever. And there was a push to try to get those people in faster because they were now at risk due to their involvement in the war and their support of the U.S. government. And so, for instance, now if you look at Iraqi refugees, their process is usually 1 or 2 years versus someone coming from Burma may wait up to 20 years in a camp. They actually even created a special system within that Iraqi community where if you can show that you actually served the U.S. military or worked as an interpreter, you can come in on what's called SIV, that's Special Immigrant Visa, and you come in with a green card. And that's someone who's already been pre-cleared by our government because they're already assisting our government. So there was an even faster route set for those people. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an example of where political pressure and certainly our politics as a nation get involved. You also have to look at the size of the population. I mean, Burma's had a continuing crisis for 20, 30 years. So, that population has continued to swell as conditions have gone on. And so I think that plays a part too, is how many refugees there are out of each population.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other? Do you think there's there any other political incentives that you'd find with refugee populations, or in terms of the politics of refugees at all? Are there, not to be a conspiracist here, but do you think there are political motivations for why certain groups are granted refugee status or not?
Well, the decisions are decided the decisions and the quotas are set by our government, and certainly there's a reassessment of each population over time. So I think that there's certainly a lot of advocacy and lobbying that goes on related to, what a certain population has suffered, whether they've been persecuted because of their religion or their ethnic group. And those evaluations may change over time. Mm-hmm. Right now there's a lot of Burmese refugees. A lot of them are in Thailand. They're starting to close down that Thailand process, and the camps are starting to close down. And instead, refugees who are Burmese that are in Malaysia are now still continuing as a resettlement route. So I think that deals with evaluating the system and seeing what our government seems to think is who's most at risk. And that's in a general population scheme. If there's one person that's a high-profile refugee that we think is truly at risk, or the whole community is at risk of that person still being harbored there, they'll expedite that person's process.
And what political act is this? Is our refugee policy determined under? I think you were talking about it before. It's the the Immigration and Nationality Act?
Yeah, the set of laws that govern all immigration issues fall under the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Mm-hmm.
So there could be other laws that are passed or acts that are signed, but then they get codified into the INA. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for any, immigration law, you would actually go to the books and open up the INA and look for whatever section, a definition of something, or the quota for something. All of those are in the INA.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think I have two last questions for you. So the first thing I'm curious about is obviously public sentiment towards what your work entails. I know that the issue of immigration is not only in the U.S. but throughout Europe, highly divisive issue. And I'm curious if you've experienced firsthand any examples of adverse public opinions, one way or the other, I guess, towards what you do.
Sure. It's interesting because sometimes I will choose not to tell people what I do at a cocktail party, because I've had people react negatively to me when I tell them that I work in immigration law or that I help refugees. I think a lot of it comes down to a lack of education. Some people just don't know what a refugee is, and they assume that a refugee is an illegal immigrant, and that's actually totally wrong. A refugee is someone who comes in with legal status, as we just talked about, so they're not an illegal immigrant. And I think that immigration overall gets painted with a big brush for a lot of people because they don't see the differences and they don't understand who's following the law and who isn't. And that's really sad. The agency, Journey's End, has really tried hard to educate people about what refugees are and how they benefit our community.
Within like a community outreach, you mean?
Yeah, we've been doing some community outreach in the last year. We hold like a series of talks. We do 2 talks a month where we ask people to come in and we just explain to them, like, this is what happened to these people. They left their country, they were in a camp, they were brought here, they're looking for jobs or they're working now. Usually we can turn people around when we show them that refugees bring money into the community. First of all, they get federal dollars because for every refugee that's resettled, there's money allocated to assist them with they're starting their new life here. Casework management, which is what my agency does. So that's federal money that comes into our community. Money to get them housing, money to get them into ESL, money to get them shopping and buying food at the grocery store, etc. Secondly, refugees are oftentimes, I find, really willing to work. They've been denied that right in their home country. They likely weren't able to do it in the country that they were waiting in a camp. And so when they get here and they can actually provide for their family, and they have the chance of saving money, buying a home, owning a car, all things that they were never able to do. They want to do that and they work really hard. And it's really inspiring to see somebody be so proud, be working as a dishwasher and saving money, and I see them and they're buying a house on the west side. Mm-hmm. So we try to let people know that too. Landy's Candies is a chocolate manufacturer that's a local in town. They have now hired, I think they've switched over, and all of their chocolate makers are refugees because they found them to be such hard workers. They have a good work ethic. Mm-hmm. Refugees are being hired as dishwashers, as cleaners at hotels, as sewers at the New Era Cap. They come in and they take jobs that other people don't want to do. And those jobs are actually available, at least in our community. We have service sector jobs that are available. So that's another benefit that I think they offer to the community. And then they're also buying homes and settling down and, creating roots in a community. I mentioned that Buffalo takes in all 10 populations for resettlement. If you drive around the west side now, you're going to see that there's a Somali store for jewelry. Like I got this watch at the Somali store. You're going to see that there's a Burmese restaurant selling food. There's actually 2 Ethiopian restaurants now. Those are all, former refugees that are opening businesses and contributing to our society. So there's a beneficial aspect that comes out of this process. And that's what we try to tell people about, so that way they understand and there's not, I think that a lot of times when there's a lack of education, there's a fear about something. And so we try to distill that. I think that's one reason why there's an adverse reaction. I think the other reason why there's an adverse reaction is because the American public generally doesn't want to have to pay for somebody else. They want people to, pay their way, work on their own dime. They don't want to have to dole out extra, certainly for someone that's not from this country. But one of the things that I always am reminded of is the fact that, everyone who came here was an immigrant at some point. Their family came here seeking a better life. For whatever reason, whether because they were persecuted or whether because they needed economic opportunity. My family, my grandfather came over from Sicily on a boat when he was 5 years old, and I actually have his papers framed in my office because I want my clients to see that I understand, that they're going through this journey and that everyone has done it, and that I understand what they're going through, because it's a totally new thing to start all over again in a new country where you don't speak the language. And you are learning everything from how to use money to how to use the bus to how to find a job to how to care for your kids and put them in school. So it's interesting to me when I hear people react negatively how stark they are in their beliefs that these people don't belong here, because I always wonder how far removed they are from the boat or from the plane, when their family got here. Aside from Native Americans, everyone came here at some point from some way. So that's something else. I think it's very interesting and very positive that immigration reform is now actually being talked about in a real way. I mean, there have been, the DREAM Act has been on the table for years. There's been talk of revisions for years, but it looks like there's been enough political momentum since the last presidential election that something's actually going to be done. And I really hope so, because nothing bothers me more when I have a client come in who's an illegal immigrant and I have to tell them, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do for you. Because there isn't, because there's no relief available to you because you entered illegally, and right now if you were to apply for something, you're going to get deported. So I think it's a really good thing that we're looking at changing our system. And it's a humanitarian thing to do, because a lot of the people who are here that are here illegally are here because they fled something, whether it was in fear or whether it was because they couldn't feed their family. And to deny those people relief when we let so many people come in before, including ourselves, I just think that's not right. There's a human right involved in letting people be able to live their life and be able to care for themselves and pursue liberty and happiness. And so I really hope that when we reform our laws that we look at making sure that we do it in a way that protects human life, human rights, and dignity, because that's very important. So I'm heartened by this, because this would have never happened a few years ago. So whatever the reasons are for why we're looking at rewriting our laws, I think it's great. And there's certainly a lot more that can be done to right some wrongs from the past.
Okay, great. I think you answered my last question as well for what needs to change. So I'd like to thank you for your interview, and I guess that concludes it. Thank you.
Thanks.